Okay, so the first thing we're going to touch on is how you should set up any new project if it's going to be reasonably complex. And what I mean by reasonably complex is you're going to have a rig and you're going to do some animation and there's going to be cameras and there's probably going to be textures and multiple scene objects maybe. All of that complexity means that you shouldn't just have one thing. You shouldn't just have a Maya file living on its own and expect everything to go fine. That's a recipe for disaster. So to get going, what you're going to want to do is when you first open up Maya, you'll see something like this. Before, and how I would open Maya is actually not coming into some file. So if I were, for example, here in our shared directory, I wouldn't go to gen character and double click the Maya file gen. I would not do that. I would open up Maya on its own by just opening up Maya, and it will open up a blank project. And the first thing that you want to do when you're getting set up is to go to File.
Hey Kirby, sorry to interrupt. Somebody put in the chat. Can you? Oh, you are recording. Okay, great.
Yes, I remembered this time. So the first thing you want to do is go up to File and then Project Window. So what this does is it brings up this kind of dialog box that a lot of it you don't need to worry about right now, except for that you want to make a new project. So if you click New, then that allows you to rename some stuff, and it also allows you to put it somewhere. I would recommend putting it in Google Drive right away, just so that it has like it's being saved in the cloud always. But you can save it to your desktop if you're want to do that, and just make sure that you don't lose your computer. So I'll go ahead. For me, I'll go into the class resources here. Project folders, IKFK project. I don't actually have a folder in here, so I'll make one. And then I'll select that. And I'll say, this is my project directory. I'm going to name it IK or FKIK project. And then say accept. Okay, so what that has done is it's made a default set of project folders that Maya is able to recognize and use for future things that need to happen. So you can see here I've got my FKIK project. It generated that on its own. And when I double click, it has all these folders. None of these things currently have anything in them. They're just empty, which is fine. So if I were to go ahead and start making things like, make a sphere, make a cube.
Wait, did you set your project? You just made it.
So it when you make a project folder, it automatically sets it. But yes,
okay.
that is
told to set. So
what's that?
I have it. I was always told to set right away, otherwise something could go wrong. So it's like a habit I have.
Okay, yeah, no, then that's I'll go ahead and mention that right away, because that is important. If you have already gone through this process of making a project directory, then what Gil said is absolutely correct. If you already have a project folder on the go, what you want to do is go to File, Set Project, and then find whatever folder name is the correct one, and then you say Set. Boom. And then that means that it's always going to be looking in that directory for all the materials that you need, which is exactly what you want. If you haven't set up this project file correctly, or the folder is just some random folder and you accidentally, so I'll click on this one and I say set, Maya is going to give you this little dialog which basically says, hey, this isn't a Maya project folder. And the reason that it doesn't think it's a Maya project folder is because it doesn't contain this little file. Let me get there real quick. Telemedia, nope. Project folders. Okay, cool. So the reason that it doesn't think that it's a project folder is because it doesn't have this thing. which is the workspace.mel. This is something that gets generated automatically. And basically what this is it's telling Maya to look for these names of folders for stuff. So look in the scenes folder for all the scenes. Look in the source images folder for all your textures. That's what that workspace.mel actually means. And if you wanted to come in and super customize stuff for some reason, you could actually, edit this stuff. So instead of looking for images in the images folder, you could double click this and rename it to something else. I wouldn't recommend doing that. Just learn what each of them do or learn what each of them are for, and go ahead and leave them. It'll make your life easier. Cool. So once I set my project folder and I say file, save scene, test scene, you can see up here that it's automatically gone to my FKIK project, Kirby Culbertson projects, and then it's automatically gone into the scenes folder in my project directory, which is exactly what you want. So I'll go ahead and save that. Test. Cool. And why that's important is for this next step. So if I've gone through all the hard parts of making a rig, or I'm to a point where I'm like, I kind of want to try out animating my rig, the way that you're going to do that is actually to not have, not open up whatever your rig file is. Currently, I only have test in here, so I wouldn't want to directly open test and start animating in test. What I would want to do is actually reference in that file and start to put animation on that. So to do that, you go to your reference editor, which is under File, Reference Editor, and you can hit the little plus sign. It'll automatically look in your scenes directory for whatever your set project is. I can click that, hit reference, and it references in my little shapes. You can see over here, it has little blue diamonds next to it in the outliner. What that means is I can't really remove anything from this stuff. So I can't select this cube and delete it. It won't let me do that. All you can do is add stuff. And why that's useful for animation is with animation, all you're ever doing is adding keyframes. So if you wanted to select your cube and start to animate this thing, you can do that. But if you found a problem, you're like, oh man, this sphere isn't quite the right shape, but I've already done a bunch of animation and I don't want to lose all that and I don't want to break anything. What you can do is go ahead and, you would have saved your file, hopefully, and say test animation. So you can update your animation scene by updating your resource or your reference scene. So I could come back to my test file, open it, make some edit that I think is going to be important, like that. Give them some bunny ears. Save. And then when I go back to my reference, the scene with the referenced file in it, that comes over and it still has all the animation on it.
So it's like when you affect something like a Photoshop file in an After Effects folder. Like,
100%. Yeah. It's the exact same workflow. It's super powerful. A referenced workflow means that you can work on individual pieces and hopefully not lose work because something gets broken. For this, I find it extra helpful because maybe you see, oh, these paint weights aren't totally right. And then you can go in, clean up the paint weights a little bit, come back to your animation file, and bingo, it looks all great. Also, you could add in a new set of macros. You're like, oh man, I find that I'm doing, some hand position all the time, and I don't like having to reposition the fingers all the time. You could go back to your rig folder, set up some set driven key on a control that'll get added to your file, and then you could use that from then on. It wouldn't delete anything that you've done until then. It wouldn't delete any of the animation you already had on your fingers. It would just give you the ability to have better control when you need it.
And can you add macros in your reference animation?
I think so. But what that,
but you don't suggest it.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it that way. Like, I mean, I guess if you wanted to test it out, if you're worried about it breaking things, then that would be one way of protecting it. But what could happen is maybe you have multiple camera shots and you've set up different scenes for each of the different camera shots. And so you want to add in that macro just in the one camera shot. That means that it's not going to go to any of the other camera shots. But if you added it to the source one, it would get sprinkled into every single different camera shot because they're all referencing the same file. Cool. So that is the first thing that everybody should do. Not right now. Keep paying attention, but that'll be the first thing that everybody does with their project. Go in, create a new project directory in, I would recommend Google Drive if you want to make it on your own machine. That's fine. It'll be harder for me if you have any problems to check stuff, because you'll then have to email me files or upload one thing or whatever. So go ahead and make it in the Google Drive, and make sure that anytime after that, when you open up Maya to set the project to that directory, I think Maya will remember the last project that you set. So possibly when you open it up, if you forget, if that's the only thing you're working on, it'll keep doing the right thing. But I wouldn't rely on that. I would get in the habit of open up Maya, set my project, and then start working. Cool. So I've already set up my project. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually import in one of the shared assets that I uploaded. So in the shared materials directory, I went ahead and added in two meshes, two character meshes that are okay. They're nothing special. They aren't super fancy, but I think they have pretty good geometry that deforms well. They're set in meters, so they are actually much bigger than the default Maya scene. The two ways that you can address this would be to select the mesh and, oh, I keep forgetting that when I record, that's getting blocked. So I'm going to shift it over. There we go. So you can select your mesh, make sure that your reference point is all the way down here at the bottom, right at the world 0. So what you can do to adjust that is hold D and X at the same time, and you can see how the manipulator has changed. Then you can just click and drag until it snaps into, I think that's not quite right, D and X again, till it snaps right to the middle. Once it's there, this is in meters. So if you want it down to centimeter scale, so you don't have to change your world units, you can do that. You can also change your world units to adjust to that, either or. This one, I'll go ahead and just make it 0.01 of its actual scale. Zoom back in, select my mesh, hit freeze transformations so that it sets the scale back to 1. Now we're working in an appropriate world unit. Makes it easier when you, so if you do add any scene props and things like that, if you make a cube, it's going to make it at the world scale. So that cube is going to be 1 centimeter, which is going to be super tiny if my character's big. So you're going to have to spend a bunch of time changing stuff. So anyway, the other thing to notice, if you import in a file, it may do this, where you can see it says gen:gen. What that is the namespace, and it's keeping that in there just in case there's another thing in your scene which is also named the same thing as what's getting imported in. So this is guarding against the possibility that I already have something in my scene named gen. This will let it also be plopped in because it has this prefix of gen. I have an empty scene, so I don't need to worry about that. So to get rid of gen:gen, you want to go into Windows, General Editors, and then come down to Namespace Editor. Select that. You can see that right now it goes root and then gen and then all that good stuff. I would just select both of these, say delete, merge with root, and then that will, well, maybe I have to do it individually. Yep. So now we're good. So you can see over here that gen:gen has switched to just gen. So I don't have to worry about it having some weird prefix the whole time. That's the only way you can get rid of that thing on the front. Otherwise, it will kind of keep staying there even when you try and rename it and you're like, why isn't it renaming it to what I want? It's because it's maintaining it using the namespace editor. This is a brand new scene, so the textures aren't turned on. If I turn it on, my diffuse texture is still not showing up. This should have some color information. If you wanted to check to see if your model will probably have textures, the way to check that is to see if it has UVs, usually. Usually if a character it looks like, it has a face and a shirt and stuff like that, it'll have something called UVs, which is just basically a 2D representation of a 3D model. So it's flattened it out. It's kind of like a sewing pattern. You can get to your UV window by going into Windows, Modeling Editors, and then UV Editor. And so this is the UVs for this model. And go ahead and flip over to UV editing is one of the workspaces that you can use. And it's nice because it gives you both of these easily lined up. So you can see here, that's the face UVs. So if you kind of think of this as a sewing pattern or Hannibal Lecter peeling your face off, what has happened is there is, maybe I can hide these or just shift them over for a second. Yeah. So here on the head, these white lines represent where the UV has been cut. So basically you can imagine that there's been like a 3D pair of scissors that came and cut along these edge lines. And that allowed this thing to be flattened out. And once it's flattened out, you can then use some kind of a 2D texture. You either make it in Photoshop or other programs to then apply color information onto your model. So each one of these little squares, now if I were to paint, color information would show up there. This thing already has the texture. It's located right next to the MA file. It's called gen diffuse, I believe. So let's go to class resources. Oop. Dang it. There we go. All right, so inside of here, you can see that this is the texture file for this character. To link that back up, the first thing you're going to want to do is put it in the right folder so that in the future, when you open this up and you set your project directory, it'll know where to go to find the texture because this is also referenced. So the first thing you do is go ahead and copy that, go to your project directory. Mine is here. The source images folder is the folder where it looks for all textures. So if you just paste it in here, like that. If I select my model, I'm going to flip this back to classic workspace. And then go to the attribute editor. You can see the different things connected to this mesh. One of them is this thing called Haley mat, which is my material. The material, you can plug in a bunch of different color maps, texture maps. So those are PNGs or JPEGs or PSD, those types of files. You can plug those into these different channels. The only one you'll need to worry about for these default models is the color. So if you select this little node on the side, it looks like a little play button. It'll let you click a folder and select a file location for your texture. So if you click this folder, it automatically opens up your source images folder because I've set my project. Select your Gen Diffuse, say open, and then this will pop up. If when you do that, it still stays gray, that's probably because this button isn't active. This little checker button up here is your viewport, viewport's ability to show textures. So if you click the little checker pattern, it'll let you show the textures. The reason why you wouldn't always want that on, or you might toggle it on and off, if you're seeing super complicated and there's a bunch of 4K textures on lots of objects, that's a lot of information to keep track of. So sometimes if you're animating, maybe you want to turn off your textures and just focus on the models. I tend to leave it on because a lot of the things I work on are reasonably low poly, which is what this is. I think this character is only 7,000 or 8,000 polygons, which is very low. I think modern game characters for like video games, PlayStation and Xbox, like 30,000, 25 or 30,000 polygons. So 3 or 4 times the complexity, and animation characters are probably even more than that. So anyway, once you have your character texture linked up and you have your viewport turned on, you should be seeing this. So I'll pause there. That was a fire hose of information on importing in a character, getting the name down to just the single name, and then linking back up the material to its texture so that you can see the visibility of stuff. Does that make sense?
Hey, Kirby, would it be possible to have another one of those lists that you had in the math tutorial, like the steps?
Have another one of the whats?
The steps, like the
Oh,
list.
yeah, list? Sure. And yeah, to that end, I put a list. Oh, actually, I think I have it open in here. I went ahead and started a list. Oh, dang it. For the just kind of overall process of making a character, which hopefully will be helpful. This is just a character rigging overview. So make sure your mesh is symmetrical, add joints, like, the steps we did for the hand is basically what's here, but they can be applied anywhere. If there are questions or if there are additional details, I think anybody can edit this. So if you wanted to add in some notes or questions down here, maybe I'll just go ahead and do that. Questions. You can type a question and I'll try and type an answer. But yeah, I can make a list for, I guess, getting your project set up and your character imported as well. Because I think once you're here, this is when the character rigging thing would jump in. Because what we're going to do now is start at step 1. So make sure your mesh is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the reference stuff you were talking about, we're going to go back to after we have the character set up, right? Once we start to animate. So stuff you're showing us, that's like kind of like, just keep that in mind and then we'll come back. Yes,
right now, just worry about the rig. Don't worry about the reference stuff. That'll probably be not next class, but the class after that. Okay. I'm guessing that will be far enough along in the process that I can talk about taking the work that you have and referencing it in just to test some stuff out.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, so step one, make sure your mesh is symmetrical. If you download a mesh from the internet or you've made one on your own, at this point, you just want to double check that it is symmetrical, because you're going to make 100% more work for yourself if it's not. The easiest way I found just to do a high level thing is to turn on symmetry up here, which is this little drop down. And I use object X for this one because that's the direction this character is pointing. So X is kind of left to right, Z is forward and back, and Y is, up and down, right? So I'm worried about seeing if this side of the character matches this side of the character. And to do that, you can just have symmetry active, go face, and then when you hover over any of these faces, you should see a face on the other side highlighting as well. And this is looking good. It even is in the face and everything. The one thing that is not symmetrical is the hair, which makes sense because hair is usually not symmetrical, but that's okay, because what we'll do is just make the hair 100% on a single joint. We'll just put the hair 100% on the head, and that'll be easy enough to paint. We don't have to worry about mirroring our hair weights. Cool. So this one is symmetrical. If you have a mesh that is not symmetrical, there are a couple things you can do. It is going to be much more involved, and I don't know, kind of for this project, I would recommend, if you see that it isn't symmetrical, unless it's a quick fix, I would not use that mesh. It's going to make your life very difficult. So the one thing you can do, if you're not worried about keeping your UVs or keeping your color information, you could delete half the model. Oh, make sure that you're not symmetrical. So you could select half the faces, like that, delete it, and then you come in, make sure there are no lingering bits. The hair is obviously going to be a problem because it's already not symmetrical. So here, these last couple faces, they're tiny, so I didn't manage to get them. Yeah, grab those guys. So what you should be able to do with a mesh that you're about to mirror is find this edge and double click it, and it should kind of go all the way around itself. And if you hold shift, you can double click another edge and you'll see that. So this is a cross section. Now, what might happen here is this middle edge might not be in the middle of the world, which is going to be a problem for stitching it back together. So you want to make sure that each of these verts, so right now this is edge, what you can do is flip over to vertices. And actually that reminds me of something, I think it was Ellie I was talking with, where she was concerned when painting weights, she was using select mode. And she was like, well, if I have the face selected and I add influence to a joint, does that also influence the edges? Does that also influence the faces? So that's an important thing to understand about what is going on when you're clicking around on your model. If you are in object mode, that's the high level, so that'll move the whole thing. If you flip over to faces, you grab individual faces and you can move those. If you flip to edge mode, you would grab an individual edge. Each of those different options is still only affecting one thing, which is the verts. That's the only thing that Maya cares about. That's the only thing that Maya pays attention to. All that these different selection modes do is let you grab different amounts of verts quickly. So in object mode, you're basically grabbing all of them. Any vert associated with this object goes along with it. If you select face mode, you're selecting a face, but really you're selecting 4 verts. You're selecting that one, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I flip this over to what the verts are that are selected, it's those 4. If I select edge mode and I click on an edge, then you're selecting 2 verts, on either side of your edge. That's what it's actually grabbing. So when you're doing the select mode of painting weights and you're like, all right, I've selected these faces and I've added influence to this joint, you're really grabbing verts. You're just grabbing them 4 at a time. Or if you've done edge mode, you're just grabbing them 2 at a time, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do here, if I've selected this edge ring, I want to check that each of these verts are right in the middle of the world. You can do that kind of manually at this level in your kind of viewport. If you hold X, that snaps to the grid, the world grid. So if you move left and right, it'll snap to the different world grid units. So right here, it'll pop over to 1, and then it'll pop back to 0. So you know that this is actually at 0. If you want to be a little bit more careful, you can use the component editor, which is under General Editors, Component Editor. And when this pops up, you're going to have a bunch of different tabs. The only one you need to worry about is your polygons. And then the vertex X. So this is the vertex's X position. And you can see that they're all 0, which means that the X position of every single vert that's selected is right in the middle of the world. You might see something in some meshes where you're not getting symmetry. You might see something like this, where there's like one at 0.1 and one at like 0.03. So they're just like 1 or 2 verts that are kind of out of place. And if that's the case, you can easily, if this thing is still selected, like this edge ring is still selected, the component editor is pretty powerful. You can just select at the top, drag to the bottom, shift select the bottom, hit 0 and hit enter, and it'll force all the X positions back to 0. So now you know for sure that everything is set back to 0. And so at this point, this would be when you could duplicate and do the -1, and then you would have to combine. But then there's even this extra step of, so the hands, they didn't actually touch in the middle. If you remember, they were kind of separated. Right now, this mesh is still technically separate. So if I select one vert and I go side to side, it's still 2 meshes because each of those meshes have verts that are separated. So what you have to do at this point is stitch these back together. You can do that using a modeling tool called Target Weld. You can go like that and it'll stitch it. Now, if you select that vert, you can't separate it because you've actually welded those verts together. You can also use another tool, which is under Edit Mesh and Merge to Center, like that, and that'll stitch it together. But that does shift it, which is kind of annoying. So then you would have to make sure that it pops back to the 0 space. So anyway, all this is to say, to get your mesh back to a mirrored like default state, it's tricky. So if you see that your mesh isn't symmetrical, be careful. It's going to make a lot of work for you, and I'm happy to work through it with you. But if that's not what you're concerned with learning right now, I would more focus on making the rig for a biped than I would worrying about getting a mesh back to default state. Cool. So you've been, I guess, given some initial instructions, but also warned about possibility. Another place where you can get meshes if you don't like either of the default ones. So this is Jen. There's one called Sam as well. If you don't like either of those, that's fine. And if you want to make one of your own, that's fine. Another option would be to go to a website like Sketchfab, and you can just go to Explore, Downloadable, and you can grab characters from here and they're free, which is pretty cool. I would recommend trying to find things that are set up like in a T pose or an A pose. So T pose is, hands up high like a T. A pose is, it's a little bit more neutral. They're kind of at 45. So anything that's available here that has the little downloadable icon is good. This is actually set up really well and would probably play nicely. To download, I think you just have to have an account or sign in using Google, and then you just say download 3D model, and it'll give you a file. I think I recently downloaded, let's see, yeah, I downloaded this chunky little knight guy from there, and this is symmetrical. It's low poly, so the deformations might be a little jinky, and it's also in kind of a very neutral pose. What I would probably need to do here would be I would want to spend some time making sure that I get it into more of a T pose. So I'd try and modify the topology so that I'm starting in kind of arms up position. It'll make rigging much easier. Oop. Can everybody hear me? Okay, cool. Sorry, I just been getting bleeps and bloops. Oh, is that what's happened? I think my keyboard just kicked the bucket. Sorry. Here we go. All right. Okay, so those are your couple options. You could make one yourself. More power to you if you want to do that. I would recommend against it. You're going to spend a lot of time doing a part of the project that I do not require. Step option 2, use one of the default models in the shared directory, or option 3, find a model at a website like Sketchfab or TurboSquid or something and download it. You could pay for one even if you're really wanting to go that far. You don't have to pay for anything by any means. But I would definitely try and do some curation and only find models that are set up to work nicely with rigging. So if you see a model that's like this, and you're like, oh man, this, come on. I really like this model. It looks cool. It's going to be challenging to get this back to a 100% symmetrical position. You can, it's possible, but it will take some extra effort. So keep that in mind. If you find a model like this that you really like, you're going to be spending a couple hours getting it to a place where you can use it. Okay. So next up, step 2. Boom. Add joints into the scene at the approximate location where they will be used. There's a little subnote. If this mesh is with symmetrical parts, only do one side. So when laying out joints, to begin with, I'll usually put it in wireframe mode and use the orthogonal views. What this will do, it'll make it easy when you click in the scene that you know exactly where the joint is going to end up. So if I were only to use the kind of default viewport and I click like that, X-ray joints, and I click here, I don't know in world space really where that is because it's taking 3 axes into account. And I'm always going to start with the root joint or when I'm making stuff because everything needs to eventually parent back to the root joint. And the root joint Because my character is right in the middle of the world, I've gone to great pains to make sure that I've got a symmetrical character that's right in the middle. I would want to use this side view to start when I'm laying out my joints. The reason being, if I click here, I know for sure that that's right in the middle of the world. Oh, why is it being a jerk? Oh, because it's doing this. There we go. So make sure your symmetry isn't turned on when you're laying your joints out. It'll throw stuff off. So when you click in the orthogonal views, it always puts it like flat against that. And at the side view, that means that it's going to put it right in the middle of the world, which is really nice. I want to also make sure that my joints aren't enormous. So when you're creating joints, make sure that you've gone into your joint size and set it to something appropriate, just so that they aren't enormous when you're clicking out. All right, so the next joint, I usually go down, so I'll make the legs first. Let's go back to rigging, select my joint. If you click on a joint first, then the next time you click, the next joint you make will be a child of that joint. So then I'll use my front view, and I'll go like that, put a hip joint in, kind of put the knee in a general place, ankle, come back to the side view, make a toe, and maybe an end of the foot, like that. Then come back to my joint tool, select my root, and make a few spines. I'll just do two. So one kind of in the middle of the tummy, one kind of at the sternum, the bottom of the rib cage. And then I'll work out to the arm from here. Actually, no, I'll keep going up. So then one at the base of the neck, so maybe here. And then one that is at the base of the skull, maybe up here. Then I hit Q to activate my select tool so that I can click back on the joint tool, click my chest joint, oops, select my chest joint. So then I'll make a clavicle, make a shoulder, elbow, wrist. That's where I'll stop for now for there. Actually, I'll go ahead and do 1, 2, 3 for the thumb. And then I'll actually just make a single joint chain for all the fingers to eventually be parented to, just for demo purposes. Okay, cool. So all I did was get things in roughly the right position. I wasn't super concerned about getting them exactly right away, because I'm going to have to go through and select each of the joints individually anyway, because I have to rename them. I don't want to move much past this step before I make sure that that happens. So want to come in, select my root joint, root, and whatever your naming convention is going to be. I would recommend separating the name of the thing with an underscore. It'll make selections in the future much easier. Like I mentioned, that wildcard option where you put the star, then underscore and something. You can select tons of things all at the same time. That's where this would come in, which is really nice. So underscore joint would make it so that you could possibly grab all your joints in the future with a single kind of line of text, which is really nice. So once I've renamed it, I want to make sure that it's aimed the right way. And with the root joint is pretty special because it kind of needs to be on its own and oriented to the world versus worrying too much about what's going on with the character. The reason that you would want to do that is so that if you moved your joint left and right, it actually moves it left and right in world space. Or if you moved your joint forward and back, it doesn't like angle it in some strange way. So to get that going, I would just go ahead and unparent both of these first ones. Select my joint, go to rigging, skeleton, select the orient joints box, and say orient joint to world and hit apply. This is the only time I use this option. So I immediately uncheck it and then I close. What that does is it just makes the joint so that it exactly is oriented to the world. So if I moved it in the Z direction, it would go forward and back. If I moved it in the X direction, it would go side to side. And if I moved it in the Y, it goes up and down. All the other joints, I am concerned what direction they're going to be oriented. So here, I've actually got decent orientation on some of them because Maya does its best to try and, as you're drawing out your joint chains, point it at the next joint. But you can see that this one is pointing a different direction than this one. So we'll need to eventually fix that. So first up is the hip. This is the R hip joint. I will leave that orientation and just make this be how all the other things are oriented. So the up direction is actually pointing out towards the back of the scene. This knee, oh, and also the hip, I feel like is in a pretty good location to get the leg bending right. You kind of want to get it in the center of a volume. If you imagine that this hip is kind of a sphere, that would be kind of the volume that you'd want to maintain when it's rotating. So you just try and hit it in the middle, because that's what's going to happen when you start to rotate it. It's going to be influencing in this spherical manner. So this joint seems to be good. This one is not. Let's go ahead and jump into our orthographic view. Oh, and I'm flipping back and forth with the views by tapping spacebar. So if your mouse is over top of your viewport and you tap spacebar, it'll go to the quad view, and then whatever area you're hovered over and you tap spacebar again, it'll make that the big one. So you can pop in and out of the different viewports real quick. So I'll go ahead and put this knee more in the middle of the knee. And on the mesh, looking at kind of the topology, it seems like this line of polygons is right in the middle of the knee. So I'll try and orient this joint so that that kind of falls in the middle of the knee vertically, and it also forward to back. I'm like kind of halfway here. The other thing that you want to try and have set up for future stuff is to have just the tiniest amount, there needs to be the tiniest amounts of bend in your knee. If your knee is completely straight, that's going to make one of the future steps a little harder. So it doesn't have to be super bent, but having it be a little bit, you know, forward, and then the ankle where it is will move this a little bit back. Right now, my move tool is set to object, so that will make it a little easier or more difficult to place this in space. I'm going to go ahead and go to my tool settings, go to world. Now I can just move it forward and back easily. So I'll put this kind of where the ankle joint, the feel will be good. And if you take a look at your knee, you can see that this has a little bit of a bend in it. So that's good. That's what I want. Flipping back to object, you can see that that's not exactly pointing in the correct direction. This isn't directed directly at the next knee. So I will go to my orient joints tool, uncheck that, make sure that these are, I will uncheck orient children for now. Okay, so I'd adjusted it, don't like that. There we go. This will be the new orientation that I base all of my stuff on. So the X points right at the next joint, the Y points out front now. So let's see if I hit apply, what happens here. So it's not fixing it as I would want it. It looks like the X is pointing the correct direction, which is great, but the Y direction is being a little stubborn. So to fix that,
why can't you just rotate the joint? Why do you have to get orient joint options?
So you can just orient, like I'm about to unparent the ankle and just rotate it. It's a little hard to know for sure whether or not this thing is pointing directly at the next joint if you were just to eyeball it. So that's why I use this as the first step. And then the second step, I do just kind of like rotate it only in the one direction, like along, spinning it just like that so that I can get this pointing the right way. Because this one is a little less important that it is necessarily oriented exactly.
Okay. And so when the orient joint to world is clicked, it stays on the world like
XYZ.
axis. Yeah. And then when it's not clicked, it stays on the object.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yes, that is correct. So once I've got it pointing at the next joint, I'll then unparent that next joint so that if I rotate, it doesn't move this thing all around. Because if it stayed parented, then as I'm rotating it like this child object is going to be spinning, which is not what I want. But once I've got that going, I've got it pointing down correctly, I've got it pointing up correctly, I can re-parent the child like that, and then selecting that joint. It's got this crazy X rotation now because I just spun it in space. So you would hit freeze transformations. So now this knee joint has been fixed. It points directly at the next joint in the chain, and it also is oriented the same as its parent. So they're both pointing straight out. And then here, this ankle looks like it's actually pointing the right way. So its Y is up forward, X is going towards the next one, and this one is good too. So you don't really need to fix the final two joints. So the leg is ready to go. You can select the hip first, select the root second, parent it, and then with the hip, but we'll work through the rest of it before we do any mirroring. Can do that as a final step. So now I'm going to work through the spine. So I'm going to go ahead and unparent the clavicle so I'm not accidentally messing anything up there. See what's going on with that. So it looks like its Y direction is kind of goofy. It's pointing off to the side. That Y direction points in a weird way. That one's even opposite of that, and that one's extra weird. So that's not good. Yeah, so the trick that I'll do for end joints is to actually point them using that using a temporary constraint. So with our controls, we did this exact same trick with a parent constraint, where we selected the joint first, and then the Z group, and then did the parent constraint, and it snapped it right into place, and then you deleted that parent constraint, and that was just a quick way of getting it in the right location. We can do that same process with these joints so that I can make sure that I kind of get an exact opposite. So right now, this X is pointing up like that. That's the exact kind of direction that I want the head to point. But instead of it pointing like down, I want it pointing up. So if I select my neck joint first, and my head joint second. I come into constrain, aim. I will aim with -1. So instead of it pointing X in the direction, it'll point the opposite direction. So if you say aim vector -1 and apply, oh, make sure maintain offset is turned off. Then you go like that. See how now it's pointing up. So it's basically pointing the opposite direction of whatever that is. What you can do here is go ahead and delete your aim constraint. I want all my green joints kind of pointing out to the back. So I'll go ahead and eyeball that up. And then reparent. Good to go. So it looks like the X is doing well here. So all I have to do is rotate the Y. Like that. And it'll become clear why this is useful in just a second. What direction do I have there? Yep, so I got that pointing out that way. That's pointing out that way. There we go. And wrong way. Cool. So now we've got all of these joints pointing in all the same directions.
Wait, what direction were the legs pointing in again? A different direction than that?
The legs are pointing that way. And it's okay. So the reason that it's just like so I guess for bipeds, the thing that you're paying attention to is on each limb or each section. So the leg is its own kind of section. And if you were to rotate like the knee, the hip, so if I select the knee, the hip, and the ankle all at the same time, and I rotate them along the same axis, it all stays nicely in line. That's really what you're concerned with. So here now with the spine, if I were to reset up this joint chain, that, and I'll leave that separated for now. Boink. All four of those joints, I haven't renamed them yet. That's not very good. I would want to freeze transformations, make sure that the rotates are all zeroed out. And so you can see here, if I rotate the spine, then the spine rotates nicely, all in the same direction, no matter what I do. So that's the important thing for setting up your joint orientations is each section, do the joints behave in a way that's helpful? If these joints weren't all aimed the same way, and I were to grab all of them at the same time and rotate along a single axis, you would get 3 of them bending one way and then maybe 1 of them bending the opposite way because it's not oriented in the same direction. That's the reason that you're going through this rather painful process.
So is it like safe to say that the spine points the opposite direction from the legs generally in bipeds?
I mean, you can say that. It's not super important though. Like if you,
okay.
Because this leg and the other leg are actually going to be opposite orientations once they get mirrored.
Okay.
So one leg will be lined up with the spine and the other leg won't be lined up with the spine. The important thing is just that each section is lined up with itself. So the left leg bends all the same way. The right leg all bends the same way. The spine all bends the same way. Yeah?
Okay.
Cool. And then the final step of the process, the arm. So the clavicle is a joint that a lot of people will put in line with like kind of the center of the volume. I found that that really doesn't work very well. And in reality, clavicle is, you know, it's right at the front of your chest. It's a bone that's easy to break. If you've fallen off a bike or something like that before, perhaps you've broken your clavicle. But it's more pushed forward, because that when you pivot from that location, you're actually going to get much better believable deformations in your character. So pivoting from here will mean that, you know, because it's real close to the spine, you're going to get a nice lift of the shoulder. Because if you actually think about how your body bends, to get your arm above your head, it's your shoulder. You wouldn't position a character like this. That's wrong. That's impossible. To get your arm above your head, you actually bend from your clavicle, and then your arm kind of pivots and rotates like that. So this clavicle joint, it's important to put it a little farther forward so that you can get a good, or closer to the middle, and a little farther forward will make forward back bends better too. And I never named any of my spines, so that's really bad. Call it spine joint. And these are all in the middle of the body. So they don't have any of the right-left designations. And this is spine 2. And actually, it's bad to not have the same thing each time. Spine 1, spine 2, neck, and head. And I don't think I ever actually positioned the head, which is bad. So where you want the head is kind of in line with the jaw, maybe slightly up in the middle of your neck volume. That'll help, because if you pivot from this location, you'll get pretty good deformation of your model in that way. And it looks like my neck is actually kind of in a bad place. You can see it's more sunken in the middle of the chest here. I want it at the base of where my neck starts. So more like that. And what that just did is actually mess up my neck orientation. So I need to fix that by going to skeleton, orient. Very good. So that one did my aim correctly. Thankfully, I don't have to hand do that. And it also pointed the X directly at the next joint. And if you use the orient joint tool, the other bonus is you don't have to freeze transformations, because it's not rotating the joint, it's fixing the joint orientation, which is a separate thing. So freeze transformations is not necessary if you use the orient joint tool. Cool. So now I've got my clavicle, and it's my right clavicle. It's my shoulder. This one's tricky. Shoulders, like how far out or in to put them. I try and line it up with the idea of, if your arm was directly down at your side, would the arm be in a good place? So if I rotated from here, that would mean that probably this part of the arm, the underside, would kind of dig inside of the torso. I don't want that. So I'll push it out a little more, because if I rotate this down, the arm would kind of be in the, or this joint would be in the middle. of where the mesh is. So you can see like, that's decent, maybe a little farther out. Like that. That's probably good. Cool. And I've got a lot of freedom at this point of repositioning because I'm not really worried about messing any of the orientations up or anything like that, because I'm going to fix that. So the elbow, let it generally in the middle of the volume. You can see on the mesh, this is a nice kind of formation for low poly stuff. Or I'm going to try and line it up with this edge, specifically this vert. Like that. And from the front, looks like it might be a little high. It's decent. Okay, and then the wrist, bring it down just a little bit. Put this in the middle of the wrist. You can spin that a little bit. And then these, well, tell you what, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on thumb joint placement because you guys just did an entire project on joint placement in the hand. So we will allow our previous knowledge to influence what we're going to do there. Cool. So now that we have joints in generally the right place, we want to double check that everything's pointing the right way. This first one is not oriented in the correct direction. Come with the skeleton, orient joints, make sure that's not turned on, hit apply. Oh, okay. So before you can use the orient joint tool, you'll need to make sure that everything is, you do have to freeze transformations before you use the orient joint tool. Doesn't like it when there's not zeroed out stuff. So I'll highlight all of that. With that, now I can use it. Oops. So I'll select my joint, hit apply. This one, I'm actually going to want to point everything kind of backwards. My thinking being that when I bend the elbow, it's going to kind of bend directly back at the chest. So I want it to, oops. So that's the direction that I want. So I want to point the Y out to the back. So I'll start that here at the clavicle. Unparent this. And one trick for rotating in discrete amounts, if you hold J, it'll snap. And that snap is based off of this little number here in the tool settings. So snap step, you can actually leave on all the time by going like that. And then anytime you rotate, it's always popping. Or if you leave it off, J temporarily activates it. So if you hold J and you rotate like that, now I know I've rotated it like a couple ticks. So it's, instead of being straight up and down, now it's straight back. So then the next one is the shoulder. Hit apply. It's pointing up. It's not what I want. Go. It's like watching paint dry, but it's necessary. All right. Elbow. All right, so here is a tricky one. So if I were to use the orient joints, it's just going to point at the thumb over and over. So this is one that you might have to do by hand if you don't have another joint down the line that is the direction that you want it to face. So this one, I have to rotate this way first. It's not really looking very good. That. There we go. It's a little better. And hit freeze transformations. Parent. Parent. And do this one back to spine 2. And you can imagine what these would be like if I took the time, which I'm not going to. Same process as I just went through for the other stuff though. So if I rotate the hand, if I rotate the wrist joint, finger joints follow. If I rotate the elbow joint, hand joint follows. If I rotate the shoulder, that all follows. And if I rotate the clavicle, everything follows. So that's great. So one last quick trick for selecting hierarchies. Because this is all now selected, you can click on the base, go up to select hierarchy. It'll automatically grab everything in here. And you can check that if you hover in your outliner and hit F, it'll open up anything that is currently selected and it'll have this blue color. So you can see for sure what in your scene has been selected. I did that just now, just so I can double check that everything has been frozen. I'll do it one last freeze transformations. Now I'm good to go. Cool, so at this point, I'll make sure the spine is part of stuff. And I should be able to check that it's all one unit by clicking on the root joint. And I can move it, everything follows, and I can rotate it and everything follows. Now I can do a mirror for all the hard work that I just put in on both of these joint chains. Selecting the hip first, I use this R underscore. You can go to skeleton, mirror joints, search for R, replace with L, across the YZ with how my character is set up. That's the correct option. And mirror function behavior is what I want. So now I've got my duplicate leg, and you want to select your clavicle joint and then do that same thing. Now I've got my duplicate arm. So now both the character and the skeleton are set up in a way that I can use mirror paint weights. Unless you have, if your joints are just slightly off, or if your mesh is just slightly off, that will not be an option. And that will make a lot more work because you've got a lot more paint weights to do on this character than you did on just the hand. So having this set up correctly, I think is going to be pretty important for this. I will pause and ask, are there any questions about this first part of the project? At this point, where we are is here. We're at step 5. Going once, going twice. Anybody? Okay. Cool. Sounds good. I will move on. Hop into some painting of weights or binding. So the first time we went through, we selected our joints, we selected our mesh, we went up to skin, and we just went blam, bind skin. So what we'll do now is actually talk a little bit about maybe one or two of the options for this skinning operation. The default is closest distance and normalize or weight distribution is based on distance, and skinning method is classic linear. I don't know the exact definition of classic linear, but it's basically the algorithm that they use to calculate the paint weights. The one that is a little newer, I think it came out in 2016, gives you a little better results. And I think it's actually what their human IK stuff uses. It's called where are you? Or sorry, under bind method instead of classic linear, sorry. Closest distance is what the default one. And lately they came out with this one called geodesic voxel. And I think that basically makes a bunch of little cubes in space, and it uses that to determine where it should attach things. And you have some control over the amount of resolution of the number of cubes. So if you dial this up or down, it will speed up. If you dial it down, or slow down if you dial it up, the amount of time that this takes. I think it's worth it. It tends to get a much better result out of the box. The one other change that I would make is under weight distribution. Instead of distance, I would do neighbors. So now it'll only look at the hierarchy of the joints, or it takes the hierarchy of the joints into account for what actually gets painted. So I think that tends to get a much better result for things like fingers, where even if you have two joints that are very close, like the end of your pointer and the end of your middle finger, I think it only looks at the other things connected to it to add weight to. So you tend to get a little bit better result. So with those two quick switches, I also do max influence is 4. Since the skeleton is relatively simple, I don't see the reason for spending the extra time to calculate whether or not you need 5 or 6 influences on a single vertex. I think 4 is plenty. Also, most game engines, it's either 2 joints or 4 joints. That's the maximum number that it will actually accept. So if you are wanting to practice for game dev, I would use 4. All right, so with those two things selected, go ahead and say bind skin. You can see it's a little bit slower, but it's really not all that bad. So we can test and see how it's doing. That's not bad. Actually does a pretty good job in the rump and in the hip. The area that you probably will want to clean up is that line. I like to try and have along the waist an area that feels really solid. So I'd probably, all these polygons I would put onto the root. So that would be one of the first edits that I would make. And why I'm not doing anything quite yet is I'm going through the steps. So you rotate the different joints to see what's deforming well and what needs to be fixed. So it's good to just know generally, is this completely terrible and it's going to take me forever and I have a lot of work ahead of me, or do I just need to fix a few things? So you can get your model back into its neutral position by either selecting the joint and hitting 0, since all of our joints should have been set to 0 when we bound our stuff, or you can select the mesh and go to skin and say, go to bind pose. That'll pop it back into place. So if you have multiple things all doing crazy stuff, you can always just select your mesh and say, go to bind pose for this part of the process. Before you start adding controls and a lot of fancy stuff, if it's just paint weights, you can always use that to get back to a neutral state. All right, so let's see how the spine is doing. So select both the spine joints. Looks pretty good. Collapsing a little bit, that might be unavoidable with just the amount of information on this mesh. And also that's one of the limitations of joints. This is how they deform. They don't take into account like, oh, there's organs and stuff underneath of this skin. And when I go like this, those organs push back out. That's not what a joint does. A joint just says, hey, vert, rotate this much or move this much because I have this influence over you. So keep that in mind. You're never going to be able to get the type of movement if you're bending like this. This thing is never going to poke back out unless you have another joint here that you've painted influence to and you have set driven keys on that push that direction when you rotate this thing. Like, so you have to really go the extra mile to get joints to do that thing. You can use other deformers to make that happen, but joints don't do that. So let's see what the clavicle's doing. Ooh, that's pretty darn good. This is always one of the harder positions to do, and this actually out of the box is pretty darn good. Yep, arm above the head, pretty good. And then arm down by your side. So here is one that's always tricky. So yeah, this is moving up and also pushing the chest in. Definitely don't like that for bending the arm. The chest should stay still when the arm is moving. So that's an area to fix. Elbow. I'm guessing this one will be pretty good. Actually, it's really not that good. See how all the way up here in the bicep stuff is moving when you rotate the elbow? You can kind of think, oh yeah, muscles and things are firing. But with this type of rig, which is more simple, in general, you want the volume before the joint to maintain and the volume after the joint to maintain. The only thing that should really be doing very much deformation is kind of this area in here. You want to kind of limit all the stretching and bending to there. For the elbow, also the knee, I think should follow that same pattern. And here in the wrist. Yeah, this one's very hard too, but that's pushing up and down a little too much here in the forearm. I would tend to weight more stuff to the elbow to fix that. That's kind of wobbly. Cool. So that's an example of kind of working through your rig, seeing what the problems are, and identifying the different zones. And once you work on one of the zones, for example, let's go ahead and clean up. Say that I want to work on this knee. Actually, that's pretty good. Yeah, let's work on the ankle. So let's say I wanted the pants to basically kind of stay put when I rotate the ankle. So I'll weight all of these polygons, or all of these polygons will be 100% on the joint, or all these verts, I should say, are going to be on the ankle here, or sorry, on the knee. So I'll go to paint weights. And you can see that because those faces were highlighted, when I hopped into the paint weights mode, these verts are selected. So really I can use the flood operations because only these verts are allowed to be affected at this point. If I were to try and come in, oh, I never renamed my joints. That's very bad. I should do that. You can see when I select what should be the knee. If I try and paint down here right now, I can't because those verts aren't selected. But I can paint the selected ones. So it's one way of kind of guarding what will be affected and what won't be affected during paint mode. Cool. So now that I have cleaned up that pant leg, I want to test and see that my mirror paint operation is working. So before I do that, I need to make sure to set back to default pose, select my mesh, go to skin, mirror skin weights. We're going across the X and Z. And I believe to go from this side to this side, it's going to be unchecked. So if I hit apply, let's see. Yep, so the cuff stays put. And before I did that, I just undid a few steps. You can see it's all bendy. And then select it, hit apply. Now it's like that. So I can be sure each time I use my paint weights operation, it's going to grab stuff from this side of the model and put it on this side of the model. The dividing point is this line right in the middle. So your middle verts aren't going to really benefit from this operation. It's only the ones on the outside. All right, come back to bind pose. And that is an important point. Does that make sense as to why I want to check early that the mirror is working? Cool. All right, and I was very bad and did not name things ahead of time, so now I have to name them by hand. Actually, D cool R to all and R to. And here all I'm doing is copying and pasting stuff so that I don't have different spellings on either side. It's something that happens all the time when I'm typing. I'll accidentally add an extra character or leave out a character. So even if I've done that, at least that mistake is on both sides. So when I'm doing selections, it'll happen the same on both. What I was referencing earlier with the selecting stuff, what you can use is up here. If this is set to select by name, I think by default it's on this, the absolute transform option. You can click over to select by name. And if you type inside of quotes, or actually, no, I don't think you even need to use quotes. You can just type star underscore or star and then whatever the ending. So anything that ends in underscore JNT would be selected. And so you can see that that's actually happening. And you can see that my clavicles were actually left out because I didn't do my right naming convention. So I would need to come in and fix that. Now if I redid that, it'll select everything. So there you go. Where this becomes really, really, really powerful is, say, for example, you duplicate this joint set. So now you have two R clavicles. What you can do is modify their names and say, like, instead of ending in underscore JNT, you can end in underscore FK JNT, like that. And then now you have a duplicate joint set real quick that has this new naming convention, and it's really easy to keep track of. You know exactly what's going on. So yeah, that'll come into play later. We'll go into detail on that. Cool. So this is kind of the first steps, and I'm hoping that over kind of the rest of this day and maybe, so today's Wednesday, right? Yeah, so actually you got over the weekend. Yeah, I'm guessing that by next Wednesday, I'm hoping that everybody can get to this stage. And by this stage, I mean, if I had actually gone through and painted weights and everything looked good, everybody can get to that stage with their character. So where we will be at this point next Wednesday is in a place where we can start to add controls and add in FK and add in IK and how we're going to structure our character for our rig. Sound good? Thumbs up. Nice. Just to satisfy my curiosity, how many people are going to look around for a custom model? Thumbs up for that. Yeah. Okay. Just a few. Oh, no, quite a few. Okay. How many are going to attempt to make their own model? Oh, Gil, maybe. Christopher Lambert, maybe. Lambert. Courtney, yes. Okay. So we got that's some. Oh, and Amber as well. Okay. So if you're going that route based on the number of steps that we have after rigging, I would recommend that by Monday, your character is completely done. Your character is modeled and UV'd and textured, and you're all the way to the point where you are adding joints and stuff. So if on Friday or Saturday, you are not very far along on your character model, I would think about that very hard because there's a ton of stuff to do. And I think it's better for you to practice this stuff now because modeling, if you already know how to model, then you already know how to model. You don't need to practice that during this. You can work on a fancy model outside of the lesson and just focus on learning this part of the process. But if you're quick enough and you can get something up and running by next Monday, then more power to you. Cool. All right. Nice. So I will go ahead and, well, I'll leave it recording now. Does anybody have any questions that are not related to what we just went over? If it's outside of maybe related to the hand model, the previous hand model, or related to anything else?
Kirby, are we allowed to do non-human models? Like if it's still a bipedal creature, is that fine?
Yeah. Yeah, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head and a spine is the kind of default for any humanoidish character. So, yeah.
I also have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have like a requirement for how many polys are there for the model?
No. I actually found a super low poly one that was only like 1,500 or 2,000 polygons for a whole character.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, if there's a model that's super duper high poly, if it's approaching 100,000 or 150,000, I think that will make animation really hard unless you have a monster machine, because all the paint weights and stuff that you do, a skin like those deformers have to keep track of vert positions every frame and all that stuff. So all that information has to be calculated anytime anything changes. And so that's why if you have a super complex model with lots and lots of verts, it's going to be a real pain in the butt to animate. You probably won't ever get real-time playback when you're scrubbing your timeline. You'll struggle with paint weights. It'll be really annoying to position things. The normal workflow that I think a lot of studios use because they have really high poly characters is to actually have 2 versions of them. They'll have a low poly character, and that'll be the one that people animate on. And then there are ways of getting that information onto a high poly character that you never actually animate. It just gets dropped on there and you test and see that everything's working correctly. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you.
Nice. Well, it looks like we have an hour, which is good. This is what I was planning on. Please do searching. Please do good locations. Download, bring it in, double check that you have the good symmetry. If you don't have good symmetry, I'm happy to work through trying to get it symmetrical with you. It will certainly be faster than starting from scratch, but it is tricky. And when you do things like deleting half and mirroring, it could break stuff like the texture that's on your model. So if you've downloaded this awesome Fortnite looking character and it's in a crazy pose and you delete half of it, then all the color information on that half of it gets deleted too. So you would have to rebuild all of that and reset up that whole side of the character, which is possible. All of this is possible. It just takes time. So there you go. Nice. Well, good luck, and I will keep an eye on my email if there are any questions, but I will see you guys on Monday with hopefully some joint setup, some good names on those joints, and some good orientations on those joints, and perhaps even starting some skin weights. So with that being said, I will say later, and happy hunting, and good luck. Later.
Bye. Thank you.
No problem.
Kirby.
Bye.